History remembers the wars, but it forgets the jobs that broke the kids. We glorify generals, we build monuments for battles, but tucked between the pages of dusty history books are stories far darker and far smaller. Stories of 12-year-olds crawling through coal chutes, of teenage girls risking their lives in exploding factories just to earn enough to eat. See, in 1800s America, childhood wasn't a phase. It was a workforce. And if you were a teenager, you didn't dream about prom or posting TikToks. You were too busy trying not to die on the job. And today we're digging up the wildest, weirdest, and most brutal jobs teens were actually doing back then. Jobs so strange you'd think we made them up. Except we didn't. America did. Let's start with the first job, the chimney sweeps. They were called climbing boys, but they weren't boys for long. In the 1800s, wealthy American families loved their fireplaces. Cozy nights, roaring flames. But that comfort came with a cost. Someone had to clean those chimneys, and that someone was usually a child. Small hands, thin limbs, bodies just the right size to wriggle up soot-stained flues that grown men couldn't fit through. Most of them were as young as 6 or 7. By 13, they were already considered too big for the job. These kids weren't just getting dirty, they were inhaling black carbon day after day. Scraped knees, burnt hands, permanent lung damage. Some didn't make it out. Some got stuck and suffocated in the dark. Others slipped and fell to their death. The job paid almost nothing, but for orphan boys or the sons of desperate families, almost nothing was better than starving. And here's the wild part. This wasn't some rogue job on the fringes. It was legal, normal, even expected. Chimney sweeps were as common as delivery drivers today, only these delivery routes ended with permanent damage to the spine, lungs, or soul. One boy reportedly said, "It's warmer in the chimneys than outside in winter." Let that sink in. But if you think crawling through a fireplace was insane, wait until you hear what teenage girls were doing with phosphorus. She lit the world, and then it lit her from the inside out. In the mid-1800s, young girls, some barely 13, worked in match factories. Back then, matches weren't struck with safety. They were made using white phosphorus, a substance so toxic it didn't just cling to clothes. It soaked into the skin, the jaw, the bones. They called them the matchstick girls. From the outside, it looked like honest work. Rows of girls dipping wooden sticks into phosphorus paste hour after hour. Their fingers stained pale yellow, their lips glowing faintly in the dark. But the glow came with a cost. Some girls developed what was called phossy jaw. It started with a toothache, then swelling, then slowly, their jaws began to rot. Bone by bone, flesh by flesh, and the smell, it clung to them. Many were told to hide it, to keep working, because complaining meant losing the only income they had. So they smiled, through rotting teeth, ate through pain, and worked until they disappeared, buried in unmarked graves, while the world struck its match and never looked back. And history, it rarely tells you that the flame in your hand once came from the body of a girl who never got to be one. Some of those girls didn't live long enough to see adulthood. Their lives burned out like the very matches they made. But over on the railroad lines, it was a different kind of danger. Not glowing, not silent, but loud, fast, and merciless. Because the next job on our list didn't kill quietly. It shattered bones. It crushed skulls. They called them breaker boys. Young, soot-covered kids, some as young as 8, perched on wooden planks above conveyor belts in the coal mines. Their job? To separate slate and rock from chunks of coal with bare hands, as it rumbled beneath them. Day after day they sat there, crouched for hours, fingers bleeding, backs twisted, lungs blackened by dust that clung to their insides like death itself. There were no helmets, no gloves, no childhood. The noise was deafening, the coal dust thick enough to chew. One wrong move and your hand could vanish into the gears. Some boys lost fingers, some lost arms. And when they couldn't keep up, there were always more boys waiting outside the fence. Hungrier, smaller, cheaper. It wasn't just work, it was survival. Sold to them under the promise of a few cents a day. In a world that celebrated the coal that powered cities, Nobody ever talked about the kids who sorted it with their skin. Because history remembers the empire, not the soot on a little boy's face. But if you thought sweeping chimneys and glowing in the dark was bad, wait till you hear this next one. Imagine being 14 years old, already hardened by factory air and soot, and then being hired to pose completely still for hours. Not for a painting, not even for a photograph, but for death itself. Back in the mid to late 1800s, post-mortem photography was an eerie but oddly sentimental practice. Families wanted one last image of their loved ones, often because it was the only photograph they'd ever have. And teenagers? Well, they were the silent hands behind the curtain making it all happen. These kids would position the lifeless bodies, fix their hair, open eyelids, prop up heads with hidden stands. In some cases, they even painted pupils onto closed eyelids to give the illusion of life. Think about that for a moment. Being a teenager tasked with staging the dead to look alive. It was quiet work, morbid work, and sometimes it paid better than the mills, but it left invisible bruises. You couldn't exactly unsee the things you saw. In an era where childhood was fleeting and grief was common, even mourning became a job. And behind every eerie photo, there was often a young assistant, just trying to earn enough to make it to the next week. But not every strange job was tucked away in shadowy parlors or behind velvet curtains. Some played out in broad daylight, in the middle of streets, under the scorching sun, and right before a crowd of curious eyes. Because when the newspapers weren't enough, and when word of mouth moved too slowly, there was only one way to grab the city's attention: hire a human billboard. They didn't carry signs. They wore them. Teenagers, mostly boys, were hired to roam city streets wearing heavy wooden signs strapped to their shoulders, one on the front, one on the back, turning their very bodies into walking advertisements. Rain or shine, heat wave or frost, they paced the same routes for hours. Silent, sweaty, and practically invisible to everyone but the pigeons and cobblestones. Some signs advertised soap. Others screamed about miracle tonics, theater shows, and political candidates. One poor soul even carried a board that read, "Is your hair falling out?" as he himself went completely bald by 17. And here's the twist. They were paid next to nothing. It wasn't just a job. It was a billboard with feet and a soul. But in the eyes of the business owners, the boy didn't matter. Only the message he carried. And maybe that's what stung the most. They called it work, but for many of these kids, it was something else entirely. A deal struck too early. A weight carried too young. They weren't building resumes, they were keeping their families alive. Each job we've uncovered wasn't just strange or shocking. It was a mirror into the desperation of an era that expected children to carry the burden of grown men. Behind every coal-smudged face, every glowing jawbone, every ink-stained hand was a child whose name never made the textbooks. We remember the titans of industry, but we forget the small, tired hands that held it all up. Not every legacy is carved in stone. Some are buried in factory dust, or folded into the pages of newspapers long since yellowed. But if you listened, truly listened, then maybe, just maybe, their stories didn't disappear. Maybe they were simply waiting to be told. So, here's to the forgotten kids, the ones who labored in silence, who grew up too fast, and who taught us, without meaning to, that survival is a story worth telling, even if it was never meant to be heard.